Our guest today is Andrew Lawton, author of The Freedom Convoy, 3 weeks that shook the world, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world. Hello, Andrew.
Hey, good to talk to you, Robert. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, good to see you again. I'll give the official introduction, the official bio of Andrew, right from the book, so I'll make sure I'll cover all my bases. For those who don't know, Andrew Lawton is a senior journalist at True North and host of The Andrew Lawton Show. He previously hosted a daily talk show on Global News Radio, which I listen to quite religiously, Andrew, in London, Ontario. And he published a written work across the world, including the Washington Post, National Post, Toronto Sun. On Global News, Andrew has appeared as a commentator on CBC. We won't hold that against you. CTV, TVO, CTS, and BBC World. But the unofficial biography is I've known Andrew for a number of years. He's, having lived in London, and Andrew is a Londoner, he's appeared on Just Right radio program, which aired out of CHRW-FM at Western University, going back as far as 2009, so 13 years ago. And since then, of course, we've crossed paths at all of the right occasions, at the right events, knowing the right people. So it's good to see you again. Now, I want to know, Andrew, and I'm going to ask you, maybe I'll give you an answer first, and then you can tell me whether or not this jives with you. George Orwell wrote a little essay called Why I Write. And one of the reasons he writes, and I think this might fit in with why you wrote this book, The Freedom Convoy, is historical impulse. Desire to see things as they are, to find out true facts, and store them up for the use of posterity. Now, whether or not that's why you wrote the book, that is certainly going to be an impact of the book, because it's giving the truth, at least from a person who saw it firsthand. Does that not fit in with perhaps why you wrote this book, Andrew?
It does. And I think that there are two big reasons for that. The first is that it is something that is, I think everyone would accept as fact, easier to write something when it's fresh, when you have the facts available to you and you've had less time to sort of change the narrative in your own mind. But also, this was an event that really had, as one chapter is titled, dueling narratives to it. So it wasn't just where everyone was looking at this thing, and by the time, February 20th rolled around, say, everyone could agree on what had happened. There were still vastly different interpretations of what the convoy was, who made up the convoy, what it stood for. And I felt, if I can say so with perhaps full awareness that it perhaps sounds arrogant, I had, I think, the true version of events here that a lot of the mainstream media reporters whose coverage dominated the media landscape missed the mark on entirely. And that was a big part of why I wrote it as well.
And you did an excellent job of dispelling a lot of the myths, misinformation, outright lies, and falsehoods that were put out there by what I call the dependent press, as opposed to True North, which is the independent press. And I'm glad that you did put it on the record, because that's one of the things about the media, the press especially, the print press, is that 100 years from now, when people want to, historians, political pundits, whoever, want to go back and to see this pivotal event in Canadian history, they are going to get a very misguided impression if all they looked at was, for example, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Toronto Star, any of the major national newspapers in Canada. They'll get some facts. They'll know that an event happened. They will get a lot of lies, a lot of misinformation, a lot of deceit, and I consider it deliberate. I know that you're in the profession, and you must be careful of how you speak about your colleagues in the press, but I have no problems about giving them my opinion about the way they've handled this affair. And I think that they really mishandled it. But I'm glad you put it on the record. And I hope people, because digital media, videos, audio, they are not searchable in the way that a text publication is. And this will be in public libraries, hopefully. It may not be on the may not be on the shelves of Indigo. That's a separate story. But at least it's available from Indigo. and Amazon, which, by the way, is where I got my copy. And I understand it took a while to get, but now I understand from a Facebook post of yours that they have caught up with the printing and distribution, have they?
Yeah, that's my understanding of it. And again, it's a good problem to have, although I don't like that people were waiting weeks and weeks to get copies, but it's because they basically couldn't print them quickly enough. My publisher couldn't. So as I understand, Amazon has finally caught up, and now it's listed as in stock and available for next day delivery or 2-day delivery, depending on where you are. So fortunately, if you are still waiting for a copy, it should be coming any day now.
Excellent. And I would highly recommend it, if not just to have on your shelf for posterity, because this was a pivotal moment in Canadian history. Something like the Winnipeg General Strike of, what was it, 1919. That's still talked about in certain circles as to being a pivotal moment for the left. Even though at that particular time, 1919, I think 2 people were killed in that strike. This was a perfectly peaceful protest. But we'll get into that. Let's start off then with some of the news of the day, which of course is Tamara Lich, Pat King being released, Tamara Lich the second time. Why did the prosecutors, why did the police single out Pat King and Tamara Lich? Because there were a number of so-called organizers and spokesmen for the Freedom Convoy, but why these 2 in particular getting the terrible attention that they did?
One thing that really jumps out at me about the government's whole response to this has been the use of fear to clamp down on dissent, to clamp down on protest. One great example of this is the infamous freezing of bank accounts that came under the Emergencies Act, which I'm sure we'll talk about it in a bit more depth later on. But the government only froze, I say only, it's an egregious violation of individual rights, but the government only froze a couple of hundred bank accounts. Now, compared to what they could have under the wording of the act done, this is a small amount because they basically gave themselves the power to freeze anyone's account if they had donated so much as a nickel to the convoy. But I would argue that freezing the 200 accounts of the heavy hitters in the government's eyes still had the same effect because it produced a chilling effect where everyone who donated $10, $20 to the GoFundMe or the Give, Stand, Go started to live in fear that the government would be coming after them. And I think the charging of Tamara Lich, making her the example, throwing the book at her, serves a very similar purpose. It's as if to tell everyone else, don't you dare step out of line.
Now, she had her name on the GoFundMe account, which is why I thought that she was singled out, is because she was the person who had the GoFundMe put money into her own personal bank account, because they had no idea of the extent of support that they would receive from Canadians. And when it got into the 8 digits, over $10 million of support, I guess that's why she became the focus. She was the person with the name on the account. Is that what your submission is?
Yeah, but I mean, the things she's charged for have nothing to do with the money. The things that she's charged for really have nothing to do with anything. So I think it's that because of her connection to the GoFundMe, she was a much more prominent person in the media. She was a much more prominent leader among the leaders. So I think it was that she was the highest profile person. So if they did want to cut off the head of the snake, so to speak, she would be that head.
Now, Pat King, you note in your book that the organizers as such, and I put that in quotations or air quotes, because this was a very much a grassroots event, self-organized. That's what comes out of the book for me, and I didn't realize that this was not a major organization. This was so grassroots. This was Canada in revolt against tyrannical rule. And I use that word advisedly, revolt, by the way, because these words have a way of coming back on you. But Pat King is not mentioned highly by a lot of the organizers. And do you want to explain perhaps why? Even though he was, again, arrested, like Tamara Lich, and spent a considerable amount of time in jail.
I would, if you'll mind, if you don't mind indulging me, Robert, I need to take a detour here to explain why Pat King's role is so relevant first, because Pat King has been to the mainstream media's coverage of this the quintessential figure of this all, the linchpin, the organizer, the most critical figure of it, and I. Looking at it from an observer's point of view, it's because he was the weak link. He's the one who does have documented evidence of comments that are, I think, very unadvised, very uncivil, to put them gently, and to put them more serious. He's denied the Holocaust, or at the very least has minimized the Holocaust. He's done things that verge on the language that you hear from white supremacists. And so the media used him as being the example of why the convoy is all of these things that they were saying Pat King is. And I deal with it in the book, and I think a fairly even-handed way. I say that he was very much a part of the convoy story. He had a large audience that he used to promote the convoy in its early days, and a lot of people certainly would have learned about it through him. But as far as the organization itself, such as it is, he was not an organizer in any meaningful sense. He didn't have any authority. He didn't have any real leadership role over the fundraising, over the media relations. And to what you've alluded to there, he was actually pushed aside by the people that we would all see as being the organizers, people like Tamara Leach and Benjamin Dichter and Chris Barber. And they actually said to him point blank at one point on the journey to Ottawa, "We don't want you here, go home." And there was a very tense conversation, but ultimately he refused. He just carried on to Ottawa and did his own thing.
Right, and that's exactly what I wanted you to say, no, without prompting you, because that's what's in the book. And this is one of those, again, mistruths or deceptions on the part of, in this case, the government who arrested him, and the media who wanted to pick out somebody who was weak, or an easy target because of his past, comments. And I think they probably did a good job of it, because people did get the impression then, looking up Pat King, that he was not necessarily a shining example of the love that was displayed on Parliament Hill during the Freedom Convoy. Now, another aspect of this, and I think that this is going to be infused throughout our discussion, and that is the mistrust of the independent media, the mainstream media, so-called. I like to think that Rebel News, True North are becoming mainstream. So I'm going to veer away from calling that mainstream. I'm going to call them the dependent press, because they're paid by the Liberal government. And what was your understanding of the mood on the street of people towards the dependent press? Now, I recently listened to an interview you did on Just Right regarding Tommy Robinson in the UK, and you had water thrown over your head because people thought that you were with the BBC. Was it similar here?
I never experienced anything that I would put into the realm of assault, which, however minimal the harm of water on your head is, I think in the broadest sense, it's assault. So I never experienced anything like that in the convoy. Never heard of anything like that directed to a mainstream reporter or otherwise. There was at one point a report, I think it was from Evan Solomon early on, that he had a can of something thrown at him, but I'm not clear. And this is not an indictment of Evan Solomon. I don't know if this was that a can was thrown at him or a can was thrown and it hit him or hit near him. And I'm not trying to minimize it, because I do try to take a very fair view of this. And I would say there was a lot of hostility towards the media. And one notable example of this was anytime a reporter would do a stand-up, which is what you do when you're standing up, as the name suggests. You're looking at your camera, you're speaking, and you have the scenes behind you. A lot of people would surround them, would start shouting, would start heckling them. And in some cases, they needed to pull the plug on them. In other cases, they went to air with these sounds and slurs and verbal attacks there. And I had said to a couple of people, all you're doing is giving them the ammunition they're going to use against you. You're telling them that you are what they're saying you are, and you're giving the audience a visual reminder of that. And some people understood, some people didn't. That's fine. People can do whatever they're going to do. But I think that for the most part, the people that are the loudest, the people that wanted to be seen, the people that wanted to be heard, were still a small number in the grand scheme of things. And you look at the people that were just going about having real conversations with some of the few mainstream media reporters that were working the crowds, that were talking to people, trying to get a true sense of who they were and why they were there. But I also think that it was the independent media that won the day. And not just True North, but outlets like Rebel and Arupa Subramania, who's with the National Post, but is a very independent-minded columnist, and others as well, that really, I think, showed why independent media is important in that. And I think that it was interesting seeing some of the skepticism that people had, where I'd go up with my microphone and I had a videographer with me for a couple of days, and I'd say, hey, can I ask you a couple of questions? And people say, who are you? And I'd say, oh, I'm Andrew with True North. He'd say, oh, True North. Yeah. What do you want to know? And it was like the first time that I've ever had that experience, because typically you go somewhere and it's like, oh, if you're not CBC or you're not CTV, you're not a real journalist. So I think there was a turning point there.
Yeah, that's we'll come back again to the journalism throughout the discussion. But one thing I noticed was that when you had to cross some of the barriers that the police set up near the end of the Freedom Convoy, you had to show credentials to get through as a journalist. Now, in my understanding, you don't need to be credentialed per se to go walk the streets of Canada to ask people their opinions on things or to record major events that are ongoing. Why do you think the police would do that? And why would they reject you just because you didn't have a parliamentary pass?
Well, I think the most charitable answer to that is that country, including law enforcement officers, don't know how media works, and they don't know how journalism works, and that there is no special license or permit to be a journalist. I had a couple of conversations with police officers that were very good, in fact, when I was trying to walk by areas that were cordoned off, which they shouldn't have been, because even with the Emergencies Act, the peaceful assembly on city streets was supposed to be allowed, but that's another story. But they had decided that they weren't going to let anyone down these streets except journalists. So I'd go and I'd say, I'd like to go down the street, please. And they'd say, why? And I'd say, because I'm a journalist. They'd say, well, prove it. And the challenge there is that I would say, well, there is no universal journalism credential in this country. And one officer, I think he was with the OPP, was surprised by this. He didn't actually know. He just sort of assumed that because all of these people had parliamentary press gallery badges, that everyone who was practicing as a journalist would be able to prove it in some way. And for me, it ended up being showing him on my phone, my Twitter profile, that, I just pointed, oh, yeah, so here are stories I've written. And he had said, oh, you're verified. You have a blue check mark, go on through. And it was laughable just because your experience depended entirely on who you got. I had the next day another experience where a police officer said, I don't care if you don't have a PPG badge, I'm going to arrest you if you keep walking this direction. So turn around. And this was the reality. And it was never legal. It was never lawful. And to this point, there's not been any accounting for that yet.
No, I think that a number of people have the false impression that there's some sort of guild out there that you have to pay dues to have a badge to say that I am an accredited journalist, when nothing of the sort exists in this country, and if it ever did exist, that's the death of journalism.
Yeah, and just if I could jump in there too, the other critical point is that if we look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for all of its shortcomings, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms enshrines press freedom. But I have to tell people this: press freedom is not a category of its own. It's an example given. It's basically a sub-freedom of expression, which everyone owns. So the idea that there is a separate rule for journalists who want to walk down Albert Street than there is for non-journalists who are just individual Canadians is itself quite a legally flawed position that the government took, because all journalists who enjoy freedom are enjoying not a specific category of freedom, but the same liberty that everyone is supposed to have.
No, that's well put. I like that. It's very good, Andrew. Let's jump over to a bit of politics now, as if this isn't all about politics, and get your opinion about the Conservative Party of Canada. They basically ignored the protest. Some backbenchers may have given a nod to them at some point in time, but not until the end did they sort of en masse start to support some of the Freedom Convoy's intentions. But they were basically, like with the Liberals and the NDP, the Bloc and the Green, they ignored the Freedom Convoy. Your thoughts on that?
I think it goes far beyond that and far earlier than that. They ignored this entire critical debate in Canada about vaccine mandates and vaccine passports and the problems of COVID restrictions. And we saw that front and center in the 2021 federal election when Aaron O'Toole refused to stand up in any meaningful way for people in this boat. And it wasn't just about you need to stand up for the unvaccinated. You can just take the principled stand for freedom, for individual choice in this matter. And there were a lot of issues with Aaron O'Toole's leadership about a number of things. It wasn't just this, but we saw the People's Party of Canada have an incredible showing in the 2021 election relative to the previous election. And they were the only political party that was talking about these issues. And I don't think it's the surprise that they found a new constituency in the Canadian population when they were doing it. So you fast forward to when the convoy is going to Ottawa. And I think in this, that was September, October, November, December, January. So in the 4 months since September, Canadians who had been dutifully going along with all the restrictions were starting to tire of them as well. People were tiring of vaccine passports and mask mandates. No one understood the trucker vaccine mandate, which really had no basis in science. And you then see Canadians starting to say, okay, this is ridiculous. The truckers are rising up. These essential worker heroes that we were told for the entirety of the pandemic are the ones that we need to lionize and exalt for keeping us going, for working while we're staying home and keeping things moving in society and in the Canadian economy and all of that. And then you get this protest led by these people that Canadians are starting to support in large numbers. And Aaron O'Toole can't answer the single question about, are you going to meet with them? And it was, well, I'm going to continue to meet with truckers. Well, are you going to meet with these truckers? Well, we've been having conversations with truckers. No. And he couldn't do it. And that really was the beginning of the end, because I think the Conservative Party had moved and Canadian society had moved. And when I say the party, I mean the conservative base had moved and the society had moved to such a point where checking out of that issue was no longer acceptable.
And about Maxime Bernier, you're absolutely right. He was the most steadfast supporter of everything the Freedom Convoy stood for, and he was there on the street amongst the protesters, and perhaps much to the chagrin of the official organizers, because they quite rightfully wanted to keep everything nonpartisan. Did you have any discussions with some of the organizers about the presence of Maxime? And I understand that Pierre Poilievre walked by the protesters at some point in the late stage of it. Any idea about the partisan leanings of the organizers, or whether or not they were chagrined by the presence of Maxime, the People's Party of Canada?
None of them that I spoke to seemed bothered by their presence there. They all seem to be, I think, probably on side with the People's Party of Canada more than the Conservative Party of Canada. And a number of convoy organizers ran for the Ontario Party in the last election, not the PPC, but again, an alternative to the mainstream Conservative Party provincially. And I think that they all sort of accepted that politicians were going to come, but they didn't want it to be a politically led movement. And I think there was some frustration with how people like Maxime Bernier were speaking and having press conferences and stuff like that. And some of the convoy organizers really wanted to control the message in a fairly rigid way, and were uncomfortable with that aspect of it. But I took that not as a specific slight at Maxime Bernier, but in general at the class of politicians that they feared, rightfully or wrongfully, were trying to co-opt this movement of theirs that they tried to keep as being nonpartisan. And again, Maxime Bernier wasn't the only one there. Jim Carahalios with New Blue was there. Derek Sloan with the Ontario Party was there. Leslyn Lewis and a number of Conservative MPs were there. So it wasn't just that. But I think that was the issue, is that they didn't want this to look like it was an organ of a political party.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you talk about the downfall of Aaron O'Toole as being a direct result, or at least associated with his lack of willingness to even engage with the convoy. Do you really think that's the case? Because that happened just a short few days after the convoy started, even though it had a lot of momentum leading up to it. It was about 5 days to cross the country from BC. Or was this part of a larger groundswell of antipathy towards the leadership of the Conservative Party, which has over the last 5 years or so, at least since Trudeau's been in power, been totally ineffectual, totally living in fear of being, labeled. Put a label, doesn't matter what label, They just want to make sure that everybody loves them, that if Trudeau is doing this, we'll do it better. If Jagmeet Singh, wants this, we'll do it twice as much. That kind of a typical conservative narrative that we saw with Andrew Scheer and Erin O'Toole as just a bunch of Trudeau sycophants, ineffectual, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Do you think maybe that was like the straw? Or do you really think that it was the Freedom Convoy that really got rid of Erin O'Toole in the end?
I don't think the convoy created any change in O'Toole's position that didn't already exist in some form. But I do think it gave the critics of Erin O'Toole the impetus to do something about it. And it gave them a fair bit of cover, because I think there was a lot of frustration by Canadians, and specifically by conservative members, that this movement that was a slam dunk for them. It was blue collar. It was started in Western Canada, but had national appeal. It was led by truckers who were the essential worker pandemic heroes. It was this slam dunk that everyone should be standing up and supporting. And people may remember that even after Erin O'Toole wouldn't take a position on it, Candice Bergen, who at the time was the deputy leader, she did. She put out a statement talking about how supportive she was of this protest. So I think that it really showed that Erin O'Toole and his party were not in sync at all. And that did give the critics that existed before this, that existed before the convoy, the political cover to pull the trigger at that exact point.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned workers. This was a sort of a workers' revolt, which is interesting because it's absolutely true. It's a blue-collar revolt, and yet the NDP, the New Democratic Party, led by Jagmeet Singh, is in lockstep with Trudeau. It is now a coalition government, basically Liberal NDP government, and you would have thought that a New Democrat would be in support of this. Why the change in the New Democratic Party under Jagmeet Singh from one supposedly or allegedly supporting blue collar, supporting workers and their right to work without these ridiculous unscientific mandates, to a party now that we have which is more or less just propping up the World Economic Forum, UN agendas, 2021, 2030, anything that comes out from outside of Canada saying this is the way we're going, Trudeau is your leader, you better follow him. How do we get from, Ed Broadbent to a Jagmeet Singh?
I think one of the big explanations for that is that their support for protest, for civil disobedience, for all of these values, and even for the working class, only extended to these people when they stand up for a particular set of values. It's not a principled stand for democratic protest and peaceful assembly. It's a stand for people using those things in pursuit of something they already agree with. And there was a great line, I think I quoted in the book, and I can't remember it offhand, but Jagmeet Singh is asked how he reconciles being a party that stands up for protest and even stood up for rail blockades against oil pipelines, how he justifies supporting the crackdown on civil liberties when it came to the Freedom Convoy. And his answer was, yeah, we support climate protesters, we support women's rights protesters, we support gay rights protesters, we support protests. And it's like, well, but hang on, what about this protest? And he basically gave the answer that, well, only when we like what they're protesting for.
Yeah, that's one of the positive aspects of this Freedom Convoy that we'll probably accumulate during the discussion that occurred, and that is that we are starting to understand some more of the inner workings of people like Jagmeet Singh and the NDP and the Liberals and Conservatives, as we are now given examples that they're not in favor of protests per se, or protest qua protest. They have to be on the right agenda. Otherwise, you may be blue collar, you may be a trucker, you may be a card-carrying member of the New Democrats, but unless you toe the line as far as our agenda goes, we're not going to support you. There was a groundswell feeling that I got, and many of my friends got as well from the convoy, and that was a sort of a renewed faith in Canada, seeing these tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people supporting the Freedom Convoy over the weeks that it occurred. Did you get that sense on the ground, being there, that Canadians were genuinely happy to see that the true nature of this country is being revealed on Wellington Street and around Parliament Hill during those weeks, rather than the narrative that we're given, that the standard bears, the CBC, that Canada is this, and here's a pigeonhole that all of Canada fits into, while people like myself, people like you, people that I know of, they have a different understanding of Canada, having grown up, and I'm in my 60s now, and I've seen the narrative change quite a bit officially. But on the street, there's a different flavor in the grassroots of this country than is portrayed on the dependent press's television shows and on their front pages. I can tell you that. Did you feel that sense as well?
I did, but for me, I think it came from a bit of a different place, because one of my big frustrations during the last year of the COVID pandemic is that I wasn't taking issue as much with government's responses to COVID. I was taking issue with those, but more troubling to me was how Canadians seemed to be welcoming these things in, is that I didn't see the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates and the vaccine passports as being the actions of a government on an unwilling population. I saw them as the actions of a government complying with what a very willing population wanted. And that was the part that was so difficult, because it made me really fear, like, what's the point of standing up for liberty if I'm in a population that generally doesn't value this? And when I saw the convoy start, I really felt that was changing. I felt like Canadians had had enough. This wasn't just anti-vaxxer versus pro-vax. It wasn't anti-lockdown versus pro-lockdown. It was people that did what they were told was the right thing, people that went along with every stage of this. They got their vaccines, they got their boosters, they wore their masks, they shut down their businesses, they took online classes, they did all of this. And then they first were starting to realize that either A, it had gone on too long, or B, perhaps they were lied to about some of these things, and they really started to reclaim it. And that, for me, was a much needed dose of hope in the country I live in.
Agreed. And it certainly was refreshing to see that. That brings up a point in that a comparison of this protest, which was totally grassroots, totally touched a nerve throughout the country, and the typical protests we see from the left, broadly described as the left, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, just consider the black, what were they called, the G20 and G7 protests, the black...
the Black Bloc.
Yes, they were setting fires onto cop cars and destroying shops and totally violent. Antifa is, in my estimation, a terrorist organization. Black Lives Matter, in some cases, crosses that line as well. Aboriginals tearing up train tracks, setting fires on train tracks and on roads and blocking roads, completely violent, and to a degree that this Freedom Convoy was not. Perfectly peaceful, bouncy castles, hot tubs, shinny hockey. The whole thing was quite interesting to see. Now, when you have a left-wing protest, you don't see the outpouring of support from the average Canadian. And I don't disparage anybody by saying average, but I mean Canadians. Here you have the Freedom Convoy, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people sponsoring, contributing, donating, showing up. The left protests, and it's usually the same bunch of agitators. A handful of agitators, well-schooled in how to agitate, how to be a protester officially, knowing how to put out the press releases, how to gather in front of the cameras, all of those things to give an image. Compare a left-wing protest to this mainstream protest, Andrew.
I think one of the issues is that a lot of times the left-wing protests are really directed at society more than at government, because they're trying to say, why are you not paying attention to this, to everyone, whether it's the so-called climate crisis or whether it's some Indigenous issue that might be important but isn't something that necessarily connects with the broader population. And more often than not, I think these protests really are not broad in their appeal. Whereas everyone has lived through COVID, everyone has lived through the restrictions and the lockdowns. And I think for the challenging bit was that people that were vaccinated didn't necessarily feel like they were affected by it because, well, I can still go to a restaurant, I can still get on a plane. And I think that was the key here, is that even if someone was vaccinated, they've still been very much affected by all of these COVID policies. And I think that's why the appeal was a lot more universal on this than some of those left-wing protests you mentioned.
Oh, yes, well said. And I agree with you, yeah. There's a different target, different message, and different dynamic and demographic involved in this particular protest than some of the more individual targeted ones. Let's go through some of the capital L lies, misinformation, false news, fake news, whatever you want to call it, that came out of the Liberal NDP government and their dependent press, that were dispelled by you, and at least recorded for posterity in your book. And just to run through some of them, and I'll get your opinion on them after. So it was called illegal, yet they had a permit. I didn't know that. Thank you for bringing that out in the book. They actually had a permit to be there. The Terry Fox statue was not defaced, as the media said. No protester danced on the tomb of the unknown soldier. She was not associated with the convoy in any way, apparently. There was zero evidence of urination on the war memorial, as David Freiheit, Vilify, demonstrated the following day when there had been no snowfall, no rainfall. Of course, it was minus 20. Goes out there and he goes, there's no evidence of anybody peeing on the war memorial. And you know that evidence lingers. Rather than protesters ripping down, quote unquote, of a fence around the war memorial, it was dismantled by veterans and neatly stacked to one side. That doesn't appear in your book, but I think you can probably attest to that as well. There was no violence, except near the end, by the police, not by protesters. No protester was involved in the alleged arson planning of a hotel. Ludicrous. And honk honk is not code for Heil Hitler. You just can't make some of this stuff up. And I heard was it a member of parliament or a senator say that honk honk?
Yeah, Yara Sachs. And I almost forgot to get that in the book. I think that was actually the last line I put in when I'm like, oh, no, I can't go to press without putting this in.
How much vitriol do we have to see of honk honk, which is an acronym for Hail Hitler?
Your impressions on some of the this deception on behalf of both the government and the dependent press as to how to portray this convoy exactly opposite of the way it was.
I'll start with a personal observation, if I may, and that one of the challenges I found was that I would be out in the very, very cold weather covering this, talking to people and trying to get a sense of what this convoy was about on that first weekend. And then I'd go back to my hotel room to warm up, recharge my phone, upload some of the footage I've taken. And I logged onto Twitter and I saw all of these controversies swirling. I'm like, this isn't like, they existed only on Twitter in a way, and they didn't exist outside on the streets of Ottawa, which is a good indication that many of them were either wildly distorted or were just fundamentally untrue. I think it was that people had already baked in their perception of what the convoy was. And if they had decided this was negative and this was something that we didn't like, anything was going to be filtered through that lens. And people were really desperately searching for things that would reaffirm their existing stereotypes, which is that these are bad people. These are the fringe minority with unacceptable views. These are terrible. These aren't people that we concede any argument to or any high ground.
Yeah, it's interesting because these arguments, the ones that I just listed, plus many more, were used by parliamentarians both in the lower house and in the upper chamber as a excuse to bring in the Emergencies Act. And it turns out that they were wrong. None of these were, in fact, factual. And so the Emergencies Act, when it was invoked, and I'm jumping ahead here, was totally bogus. It was totally unnecessary. And I guess that these lies, these falsehoods were perpetrated, perhaps even with the intention of justifying heavy-handed measures later on, but that's supposition on my part. There's an aspect of the Freedom Convoy that really surprised me, and it comes out in your book, and I didn't realize it until I read your book. And that is that this was a self-organizing event. And I mentioned it before, that this was not a top-down event. Tamara Lich started a convoy in the West. Other convoys started up in the East. And I understand there was probably about 5 in total of all of the official, if you want to, or organized convoys. And yet when they get to Parliament Hill, they find out that other truckers just came, and took up all the choice spots, if you will. And when they were negotiating with police later on, to try to clear a particular intersection around, was it Sussex and Rideau, that they said basically, look, we can ask them to move, but we don't know these people. There's no official list of truckers. There's no organization. This is not a left-wing protest. This is Canadians protesting, and we can do our part to try to help the police when they wanted to unblock a particular intersection for good reason. And they find that, they're not in charge per se, really. Did that strike you as an interesting development in this whole affair as well as it struck me?
It did, certainly. And I think I understood at the beginning when I was covering this that it wasn't entirely top down, but I don't think I realized how, and I don't even want to say disorganized, because it was very organized in some other ways, but how non-organized, because I think that's a morally neutral term, how non-organized this was. And this is not, by the way, an indictment of Tamara Lich and Tom Arazo. I think they're the first to admit this, that they didn't control people. They didn't tell them what to do. And there was a huge risk in that too, because they didn't know who these people were. They couldn't make a 100% guarantee that not one of them would do something violent at some point if they had a bad day. All they could do is put out their message, which is that we're not here to overthrow the government. We're here to end the vaccine mandates. We're here to end the vaccine passports. We are here for a peaceful protest, and we are here to show love. And they put that message out, and the people that were there bought into that. The people that were there, that was what they wanted to.
Yeah, and I guess it came to a head, or at least demonstrably so, that when they finally did ask some of the truckers around this particular intersection to move, what happened when the police came to remove the barricades, the concrete barricades, people thought that they were coming to remove all of the trucks and it was all over. So the people on the street just en masse went to that intersection and prevented them from
and started
clearing
singing
it.
"Oh Canada."
And they started singing "Oh Canada," yeah. I mean, that just shows that this was not an organized event in the sense that people thought it might be. And I thought perhaps it was more organized than it turned out to be, when I'm thinking, okay, well, why are they still hanging around here and kids are here? And I'm going, it's going to hit the fan real soon, and they got kids there on the streets. I mean, I'm thinking, and I support the truckers 100%. Maybe now's the time to, clear out some of the more vulnerable people there. But it wasn't up to anybody to do that.
No, and I think that the mistake that government made and the mistake that media made was, and I mentioned this earlier a little bit, thinking there was just one thing at the top, that if they took that piece off the board, that the whole thing would end. And they thought that was the money. And I must admit, that was one of my mistakes first covering this, is thinking the money was a lot more relevant to the protest than it actually was. Because when the bank accounts got frozen, which was, I think, a critical part of the government's response, it didn't affect the convoy organizers themselves really at all. And I think this was the fascinating part of it that people didn't realize, because more money just showed up. People started bringing cash. They started sending Bitcoin. They started doing all of these other things. And when the police cracked down on fuel, people just started flooding the streets with jerry cans full of diesel, and it didn't really matter. So the problem with an organic movement from the police perspective is that it's impossible, without just playing whack-a-mole for weeks on end, to end it in a very easy way.
Exactly. And I got this point from your book, was that the money was only a secondary consideration for Tamara and some of the organizers. They certainly didn't think that they would get over $10 million. They were probably thinking in the tens of thousands of dollars. to perhaps waylay some of the expenses that some of the truckers were going to go through, because a lot of them had been out of work because of these mandates and restrictions and passports. They needed help with their fuel, and to fuel up one of those beasts costs over $1,000. So when they started to have the GoFundMe and later the Give Send Go, it was almost like, what are we going to do with all this money? Who do we give it to? And to their credit, I mean, not much credit, but to their credit, GoFundMe did their due diligence and asked who's going to get the money. How are you going to disperse the funds? Because we don't want to be a front for some fraudulent organization, quite rightly. But they were convinced and released $1 million into Tamara Leach's TD account, and then it was seized or frozen by TD. But the fact that people showed up with cash is king, doesn't that say something about the way our country's going and the world is going towards digital currency? And if we did not have cash in this country, a lot of those truckers wouldn't have been supported in the way they were. Your thoughts on that?
I very much agree with that. And the big challenge, I mean, convoy organizers that I've spoken to since the convoy, when I was writing this book, have all just switched themselves to cash only in their lives because they've had their bank accounts frozen. They've actually lived this and understand what it's like to one day literally have the government turn off the tap on your ability to feed your family, your ability to pay your mortgage, your ability to go to the store and buy a cup of coffee. And it is of critical importance that Canadians understand the implications of not just a government with the technical, theoretical capability of turning off your banking, but the government with a proven track record of doing that. Now, people may say, oh, well, I never orchestrated a protest. It doesn't matter. The government has said it's willing to uncork that bottle. And I don't think there is any going back on that. There's no unknowing what the government was prepared to do. And I have grave concerns about a government that decides to do this again and again and again at its leisure.
You better watch out. This is directed at the left government. Be careful of what you're doing, because if another government gets in that is opposed to what you stand for, what's to stop them from raiding the bank accounts or seizing the bank accounts or freezing the bank accounts of people who give to these left-wing, often violent organizations? Nothing, because the precedent has now been set all over some, people saying that they want their freedom back. And that's another issue I'd like your thoughts on, Andrew, and that is that the word freedom is now being touted as a right-wing, white supremacist type of word. And this is from the CBC, of course. And I also heard a number of people on the street in Ottawa, some of the residents who were negatively affected by the convoy, saying that they're tired of seeing Canadian flags in the Canadian capital. So these two words, usually synonymous with Canada, freedom, Canadian flag, have now been taken by the dependent press, the CBC, which is just the government, and now they're being disparaged. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great shame that the left was able to claim the word liberal, which has a connotation that's far more in alignment with what most people would describe as being conservative or libertarian, depending on how they view those terms. And liberal is now something that we've completely ceded. So there's a part of me that just thinks it's fun that now we get to have the word that everyone else is so terrified of. But the other part of that, though, is that I don't feel their issue is with the word freedom. I feel their issue is with the concept of freedom. And that's the real upsetting part, to go back to what I was talking about earlier about my fear with how Canadians so readily accepted COVID mandates. And we see it in the fight over free speech. People that say free speech is now this white supremacist patriarchal concept because it's only with free speech that only those nasty voices really win. They're the ones that emerge. And I don't buy that their issue is with people shouting freedom. I think their issue is with freedom itself.
Absolutely correct. Let's turn to the non-reaction and then the overreaction of the government. Justin Trudeau in particular, he claimed to test positive for SARS-CoV-2 and went into lockdown. And of course he didn't, because then he gets on a plane. I think he went to Dubai or someplace, I forget now. But apparently when he's here with a mask on says that he's going to quarantine. He's using it, obviously, in my estimation, as an excuse to hide, to run away from his responsibility as the leader of Parliament to talk to a major protest that's going on his doorstep. And the man is a coward. And the Liberals and the NDP and the Conservatives who support him are cowards. Would you go so far as to say that, Andrew?
I don't think COVID or no COVID, he was ever going to meet with these people. So I don't know if it was just convenient timing on his part or anything else. I'd say it actually worked against him, because now it meant that everyone knew where he was. Although there weren't any issues that I understood with trucks going to Harrington Lake, his little vacation retreat in Quebec. I think that really what I took from that is that it was a great example of what the truckers were advocating for, which is that, okay, you told us that getting vaccinated was the way to stop us from getting COVID. Well, you're double vaccinated, triple vaccinated. Now you're in isolation with COVID while the rest of us are having a good time on the streets of Ottawa. And I think really it proved their point, which is that perhaps we don't need to live in fear of this virus like it's March 2020 anymore, like government policy is making us do.
Remember, just a reminder to people out there, when Black Lives Matter had a protest, what did Trudeau and Singh do? And they come out from the Parliament building, they go and they take a knee in some sort of faux sympathy to the movement of Black Lives Matter. And yet,
yeah, but again, you're not. You have to be rooted in the science here, Robert. The virtuousness of the cause affects the epidemiological qualities of the virus. Everyone knows this.
Exactly. Yes. The hypocrisy is amazing. What do you think of the mainstream media, MEAN, stream media, the dependent press coming out and doxing a lot of the donors? Once it was the GoFundMe that was hacked, or the Give Send Go? I forget.
The Give Send Go.
Give Send Go was hacked by this one nutbar who went onto YouTube and says, I hacked it and I'm responsible. And if that's the case, could be a Jimmy Hoffa thing, I don't know. But he came out and said that he doxed everybody, and the press had the names, and the press were putting the names in the paper and on their TV and radio shows. I couldn't believe that they would stoop so low as to do something like that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and someone actually put all the addresses onto a map, so you could go and look on your street and find who the evil, terrible, unacceptable fringe neighbors in your midst are. And I actually did it, and it was like, oh, I guess that neighbor over at number 5 is cooler than I thought. So it had the opposite effect for me. I'm like, do I live near cool people? But I do think you're right. And just one interesting comment I drew, Robert, if I may, is that when Hunter Biden's laptop was covered by the New York Post, all of a sudden the media went to blackout mode because, well, we can't trace the origin of this. And it's against our policy on hacked materials, Twitter said. It came from a hack, so we can't report on it, and we'll ban anyone from sharing the link, and we'll freeze the New York Post account. And it's amazing how all of those ethical qualms that existed with Hunter Biden's laptop didn't exist when it came to a hacked material of people that were genuinely just ordinary people around the country. There was a woman who worked in Doug Ford's government who donated $100 and got fired because of it. She lost her job because she donated $100. People were harassed. A woman who owned an ice creamery in Ottawa was harassed because the media reported on her giving money to this thing. It was absolutely disgusting, a completely shameful display by the media, for which no one, as I understood, has apologized or said, maybe we misjudged that one. And proof positive of what I've said all along, which is that it has nothing to do with any sense of consistency. It's everything to do with, do we like you? Do we like your cause? If so, this is fine. If not, it's not fine.
Yeah, it was disgusting to me as well. I did not realize that the dependent press would stoop so low as to dox Canadians for their support of a Freedom Convoy. But freedom to the press is a bad word. What role do you think the technology of today played in this particular protest? Because my own point of view is that this would not have happened if it had not been for things like cell phones, of people going around with their cell phones, documenting it on the street as citizen journalists, Zello, means of messaging back and forth, encrypted means too, with Signal and WhatsApp and things like that. Facebook and Twitter and all the social media doing an end run around the established press. What are your thoughts on the role of technology in this particular convoy?
So one of the most compelling pieces of journalism that I did any day I was covering the convoy was simply walking around with my phone, streaming live video of what I was seeing. And that's not exactly intellectually hefty material, but it was what people wanted, because people who couldn't be there just wanted to see it. They wanted to see that raw, unadulterated view of what was happening on the ground, because they didn't trust the edited snippets they were seeing posted by mainstream media reporters. And I took my cues from the audience. I said, if that's what you want, that's what I'll do. And I kept my phone as charged as I could and walked around and just showed this. And if I saw something happening, I tried to narrate it, or otherwise I just walk around so people could see. And I did these for a couple hours at a time. And I think you are right about this, is that people wanted to be there, and the people that were there wanted to share that they were there. And they did this on social media, and the people that were actually there had these networks going on, Telegram and Zello and these different apps. And that was how they kept in communication and kept organized. And that was what contributed to what you were talking about earlier, that grassroots groundswell. So, I mean, maybe it could have existed with word of mouth and CB radios, but I really think they needed that new media, the ability to communicate with each other, and also the new media platforms and alternative media platforms to promote it and to discuss it and cover it fairly. I think that really was the perfect storm that made this as big a sensation as it was.
And now we get to the aftermath of the entire thing, now that the dust has settled and the snow has melted. And that is that, as you call it in your book, the elephant in the room is that none of the mandates, at least federally, were altered one iota by the Freedom Convoy. They were temporarily, in my estimation, lifted later on, much later on. The provinces started to lift some of the mandates, and now we're more or less back to normal. However, that was sort of in concert, in my belief, with the movement throughout the world of lifting all the regulations, not so much as a direct result of the Freedom Convoy. So what is your thoughts, or at least perhaps you can tell us what the mood is of some of the main organizers, the people on the street that went there and invested so much of their time, and perhaps even at the expense of their liberty, to get all these changes, and Trudeau, Liberal, NDP government did nothing?
There were some changes that the convoy claimed. One of them was Aaron O'Toole. Others were Quebec's abandonment of the tax on the unvaccinated, Ontario's announcement of the end of vaccine passports, Alberta's and Saskatchewan's announcement of that as well. All of this stuff happened in relatively quick succession, just as the convoy was getting to Ottawa, or just after. So whether you want to say it was the convoy that did it or not, it was close enough that I think a lot of people in the convoy felt they had a role in it, and maybe they just gave that extra push. But you are right. The federal mandates for air travel, the federal quarantine mandate, the federal mask mandate for planes, the federal mandate for working in the civil service, the trucker mandate that started this all remained on the books afterwards. And even though the vaccine mandate for air travel has lifted, the vaccine mandate for cross-border truckers is still in effect as we speak. So is the convoy a success story? Is, I think, a very legitimate question. And I think yes and no. I think they did not succeed at what their primary objectives were. But I think that inadvertently, they did hold up a mirror to the media, and they held up a mirror to the government, and they held up a mirror to people in society that were comfortable with taking away the liberty of their neighbors, of their fellow Canadian compatriots. And the line that I used in the book is that they really forced the government to reveal how far it would go to stop those who seek freedom. And while these may not have been the initial goals, I think they are successes of this movement.
You're absolutely right. I even had written that down, your quotation, revealing how far the state was prepared to go to stop those who seek freedom. That is crucial. And I think that's probably the most long-lived positive effect of the Freedom Convoy, and that is that people are waking up. You may call it the Great Awakening, as some people have for other reasons, but in Canada, we're typically a complacent bunch. we typically think that our politicians are out there for our best interest. We know that they lie, cheat, and steal like every other politician in the world, SNC Lavalin. But we generally think that they're doing things for the good of society, and now that has been shattered for a lot of people. For some people, they're part of the mass formation, the mass psychosis. They're not going to change. They believe everything that they see and read and hear from the dependent press and from their governments. But for an ever-increasing number of us, I think you're right on the money, Andrew. This event has lifted the veil. And now we know exactly how far our governments are willing to go. And not just Justin Trudeau and the horses trampling some elderly Aboriginal grandmother on the streets of Wellington Street in front of Parliament Building. We're talking about Doug Ford and the draconian things that he did. We're talking about Blaine Higgs here in New Brunswick, allowing people who sell food to deny it to those who have not gotten the mRNA jab. Those kinds of tactics from our elected officials, I think, are waking people up to just how evil they can be when it suits them. And it's all for the vote, it's all for control, it's all for power. Let's end the discussion with perhaps what's going on with True North and how your success has been. I remember when you just started out, not just a few years ago. How's True North doing? How are you doing? And what do you plan for the near future, Andrew?
Well, I think planning for the near future is a bit tough because I didn't plan for the convoy, which ended up becoming the quintessential story I've covered this year. So I should say that so far, I guess there are still a few months left of the year. True North has been growing incredibly in the last couple of years, but certainly the last year between the election and the convoy. And I think in general, there's been really a surge in support for independent media. So I'm going to ride that wave out, go where the story takes us all. And it's been a true pleasure. And I mean, I wrote this book as an individual, but it was really building off of the work that I was doing as a journalist for True North in Ottawa and covering it remotely as well. And you know, it's so humbling going around and seeing people that really felt like independent media was their only source of truth in the course of COVID and in general. And that was actually quite humbling. So we'll keep going with it.
Thank you for what you do, Andrew. Thank you for your book, The Freedom Convoy, 3 weeks. The inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world. It's a must-have for everybody's bookshelf. You can get it virtually anywhere books are sold. I got mine from Amazon.ca, but you can get it in Indigo, at least online. Once again, Andrew, thank you very much for all you do and for the book.
Thank you, Robert. It's been a pleasure.